Well, I am Keith Christich, and it is my joy and honor to introduce to you Carmen Acevedo Butcher. Carmen's here tonight to speak with us on presence practice, Unknow with Brother Lawrence and the Cloud of Unknowing. Now, I'm going to pass off the mic to Dr. Carmen in just a moment, but just as a brief introduction, Dr. Carmen Acevedo Butcher is an award-winning translator and has a PhD in medieval studies. She teaches in the college writing programs at the University of California, Berkeley, and her translation of Brother Lawrence's Practice the Presence is called The New Standard. Her Cloud of Unknowing Translated received the 46th Georgia Author of the Year Award and is a Shambhala book pocket series and an audiobook. You can hear Carmen on podcasts like Things Not Seen, NPR's Dante's Old South, Rethinking Faith, Messy Jesus Business, Encountering Silence, and more. So Carmen, welcome back to you. I'm so glad to see you. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me here, Keith. It's always a joy to be with you.
Yes, very good. We've enjoyed a few teaching offerings in the past together, so always glad to be in conversation with you. As we're starting this conference, we're asking everyone the same question here. What is a mystic?
What is a mystic? What is the current price of baby formula in New York City? What is the value of self-compassion? Who deserves our love? What is community? What is the value of a word like mystic? Those are the questions that came to mind.
Carmen, thank you.
And the reason that I asked the first question, what is the current price of baby formula in New York City, is I think my mystic heart, my human heart, my wise lover heart is always very concerned with how long does it take for someone to work to buy baby formula, wherever they are. So being a mystic would be someone who's a wise lover, it seems.
I love that and how you open that with my mystic heart, my human heart. It's not this otherworldly phenomena. It's the right here and the right nowness of life.
Yeah, exactly. And we can talk even more about that because Brother Lawrence is big and the Cloud of Unknowing on the down-to-earthness. Yeah. So thank you for saying that.
Well, thank you. Beautiful. Well, then why don't you take us into these two? Perhaps some folks might be new to the Cloud of Unknowing or Brother Lawrence, but who were these two authors of these classical spiritual texts?
Well, I love that you're starting there with the authors because they are two people. And that brings us again into the very community aspect of what we're talking about. We have the Cloud of Unknowing author who has chosen to remain anonymous for many possible reasons, but I think he was, and many people think he was, a Carthusian monk. So that tells us that he spent a lot of time in silence and contemplation. I also think, along with Julia Bolton Holloway and others, that he was someone who really was in the highways and byways of life. He was in court situations, just the way he talks about people. He has seen people up close and personal, people involved in real worldly, secular, and high church matters. So he was wise in many ways, and he was educated. I think he might have had what we would call a blue collar background, but he is somebody who read lots and lots of books. Now, chalk and cheese, as my British husband would say, we have Brother Lawrence, and he was truly a nobody in his society of 17th century France. And he was part of the 98% of the Third Estate. He had no chance for an education. people make a big deal about the fact of how he was so wise and not educated, which I think is truly patronizing. But he went into the military when he was a teenager. What other choices did he have is what many people think. And he was injured severely in the 30 Years' War, and he quit the military, and he limped and was in pain the rest of his life. No Advil, no real understanding about such things. And the last 2 years of his life, he had absolutely no mobility whatsoever. So in amongst all those things happening to him, he failed as a valet, he failed as a hermit, he had many difficulties. And then he had an uncle who was a discalced Carmelite lay brother, and he followed him into the Parisian monastery of the Carmelites and found peace eventually. And how he found peace and how Anonymous found peace, that's, I think, why you invited me to talk today. They found peace in their everyday lives with whatever life brought them. So I'm looking forward to talk more about that. But they were very human people, very human people. I can't, some of the tone of their writing, both of them, they neither one of them really suffered fools gladly. I mean, they're very human. We can talk about that some more too if you want. I love them both.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. I mean, I'm very human, so that really resonates with me in so many levels that it's just like to be a mystic again doesn't mean that you have to be a monk. It doesn't have to mean spiritual experiences. It doesn't mean you any number of these sort of mystical understandings. They're too mystical in some ways. So
Can I add to that? You don't have to have a PhD. You don't have to have advanced degrees, even in theology. I mean, this is the thing we forget, is that when you say mystic, I just think human, ordinary, everyday life. So, yeah.
and probably in many ways, those PhDs will maybe get in the way if we think we know too much. It gets in the way of our beginner's mind.
Well, whatever it is that challenges our humility, and it can be really anything, right? But definitely education has been historically one of the routes that has been an impediment in many ways, like ways that we need to. I think education teaches us some things, but what it mostly teaches us is what we need to unlearn. That's my experience. I'm grateful, because my father told me we can't afford to send you to school at all, like not even for a bachelor's degree. We had no money. So I'm grateful for my education, but I'm even more grateful for love. So yeah, good point.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Well, so these two mystical teachers, these two mystical authors, writers, you've had the joy of translating them, and I'd like to know how it is you came about translating them, what it was like, what is the meaning to translate these sacred texts?
Wow. Well, thank you, first of all, for asking that, because historically translation and translators haven't got much playtime. So thank you so much. I will say that, first of all, it was no grand plan. I felt tugs at my heart. That's really the bottom line, is both of them tugged at my heart. I had grave difficulties growing up of trauma during my childhood, much deep, severe, long-lasting trauma. And so I spent a lot of time, like my patron saint of nature, Mary Oliver, the poet, out in nature. And over the time, I didn't realize it, but I was praying the presence prayer and doing other kinds of contemplation. So it's just a gift, right? When your heart needs it and the Spirit meets you there. Then I went to school, eventually to graduate school, and mostly to live with my sister Angie, and I had to do something and I couldn't get a job. So I thought, well, I'll teach as a TA if I can get it, and I'll go to graduate school so I can live with my sister. Literally, I went to graduate school so I could live with my sister because we're really good friends. And during that time, one of the books we were assigned to read, isn't this very prosaic, was this book. I couldn't even remember the name of it, but it was by a guy named Anonymous. I was like, why doesn't he want his name on that? And it was, I later realized, the Cloud of Unknowing. And the way he talked about prayer was not foreign to me. It was my experience. So he gave words to it. And then for practice of the presence, I had an editor friend who kept emailing me and saying, would you like to do another book? And during the pandemic, finally I had bandwidth, because until then we were moving from Georgia to California. My father died and there was a lot, I just didn't have the bandwidth. And so during April or March or so of 2020, my friend Lil Copan, big shout out to her, contacted me and said, how about a book now? And I said, okay. So we met, and literally, Keith, for 2 hours, she said, here are some ideas. And she had, I think, 40, I wrote down ideas, and we had great chat. We were about to sign off, and she said, oh, by the way, there's also Practice of the Presence by Brother Lawrence. And everything came to a stop. And something in me tugged. And I didn't even tell her how weighty it landed with me, because I thought, if his theology isn't healthy enough, I can't spend that intimate time translating it. So let me go sneakily check it out. So I did. I went to the National Library of France online, who I'm grateful to for making it free. I read his original books and Joseph of Beaufort's, and I fell in love. I mean, there was so much death at the time. My students, parents, and uncles and aunts are essential workers, and they were experiencing extreme circumstances and grief. And friends of mine had relatives dying. And so I was always also about to possibly lose my job if we didn't have enough people sign up for class. I mean, no, those were really, you remember the summer of 2020.
Yeah.
You could hear birds like never before, because California was in a lockdown. And I would get up at 4 a.m. and translate his letters and also his spiritual maxims. And it was like entering either a forest or a cathedral for quiet. And I fell in love. And I have to say, Keith, I'd only read parts of Brother Lawrence before, and in translation. And those translations did not have translator notes. So I didn't know what was their slant on Brother Lawrence. Do you understand? Like, was it accurate? Was there a, so I had to go see for myself. And where the Cloud of Unknowing really, as Father Thomas Keating says, when you meditate, it brings up some shadow self stuff, it brings up stuff. And for me, the Cloud of Unknowing translation was really shadow work. And then for me, Brother Lawrence translation was discovering the gold in my shadow. And I will forever, until I'm 90, be grateful for that opportunity, because it was the Spirit helping me to heal, grow my soul, and also sort of find new true selfness in my own self. So I'm just grateful that I was allowed to do it. I feel immense gratitude. And at the same time, I would think to myself, because when you translate, Keith, you translate for yourself first. If you're not translating for yourself, why do it? Do you understand? But at the same time, I'm the oldest child in my family. At the same time, I'm thinking, what will this bring to others? Like, what will it benefit my friends if they were to read this? What will it benefit my students? So you're also thinking, what do these ancient works bring to now? And I know that's what you want to talk about some more, because they are so rich in wisdom that is as fresh as the breeze coming through the window right now.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I gotta say how grateful I am to you and other translators, because I don't give it second thought that of course I have this beautiful book written in English, but of course in French or Old English. And I would never be able to read those books. And so for the beauty of your work and people like you, thank you.
Thank you.
Making it accessible to the millions. So
you're so kind.
Well, I know The Cloud I've read through many times, and Brother Lawrence, and The Cloud is so much about contemplative prayer and practice and silence in some ways, and Brother Lawrence about practicing in daily life. And references to Lectio Divina. What is the relationship between contemplation, contemplative prayer and practice, and this practice of Lectio Divina that pops up?
Wow, that's such a wise question, because I mean, Lectio Divina, or sacred reading, is truly at the foundation for both Brother Lawrence and Anonymous and all contemplation. And really, as Thomas Keating says, it was the practice for the first, 15 centuries or so of Christianity. And what I love about it is it's like a re-scripting of my mind. And in fact, I have an example here. I have this, I don't know if y'all can see this, and it folds. This is, it says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." And so it's Matthew 11:28-30. And this is what I fold up and put in my back pocket, take with me to the marsh, maybe put on the seat of the car. And this is what both Brother Lawrence, as a lay brother in the Parisian monastery in the 17th century, and also Anonymous as a possibly Carthusian monk, maybe a priest, but either way, both of them spent countless hours in Lectio Divina, in singing the Psalms. There is no way that you don't learn, or I wouldn't learn, more about ourselves singing these emotional songs. I mean, they're like an emotional how-to manual. I mean, they cover everything. And they would spend, whenever you see in the monastery guides, it'll say reading. And, we think, oh, a novel, I don't know what we think, but the reading was also Lectio Divina, right? Where they really steeped. And I always love the image is of a cow chewing its cud, because I was raised in the country. And so it's the kind of reading where I may spend 20 minutes on the word come in Come to Me. And if I've looked it up, which of course I would have, because I'm a word nerd, and looking to see what it is in the original and understanding it to be a very, like if I were to say to you, Keith, hey, come on over, Keith. I mean, it's a very informal, family, intimate invitation. Especially if I were to say to you, hey, Keith, you want to come sit on my front porch? If I had a front porch, your front stoop, we could sit on the front stoop. But if I said, hey, come on over, let's have a chat, that come to me is such an intimate invitation that I could spend 20 minutes or more just on come to me. And I've also done Lectio Divina with Jesus Wept. And so it's part of, I think it's chapters 33, 34, but anyway, it's in the 30s of the Cloud of Unknowing, where he says, of course, the basics are Lectio Divina, but those are covered elsewhere. But any beginning person in contemplation will always do Lectio Divina. But there, I always hear my friend James Finley, I hear Jim saying, aren't we all seasoned beginners? So it's not like we outgrow the need for Lectio Divina. Like, it's sort of like if we were to say, oh, I think I've outgrown the need for food. I am a superior human being. It's just nobody outgrows the need for food. And, Jesus went out into the wilderness and was tempted by the adversary. And at one point was said, turn these stones into bread if you're such a big whoop-de-doo. And he said, but humans don't live by bread alone, but by every word that comes out of the mouth of God, or love, or mystery. And that's Lectio Divina, isn't it? I mean, it's that meditating on, and it really is, to go back to I was really glad you read the title to remind me and all of us what we were supposed to talk about. It really goes back to that unknowing, because I have a script, Keith. I have a way I think the world should go, my world in particular, and anybody I come in contact with. I have a list of to-dos. I imagine you might, I don't know, but like I have a list of to-dos that I'm very happy when I can check one off. I mean, I have a schedule, right? And so I think these are all normal things, but if I get too bound up in this egocentric, the egoic knowing, then I really do shut down a large part of my humanity. And by feeding myself these words of come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest, I have spent literally years asking the Spirit, what is rest? I have literally spent years on just that word, rest. I even for a while, to extend the Lectio Divina, carried around one of those little worry stones that I had bought at a children's museum years ago when our kids were young. And I was a field trip monitor, you know, and it had on there rest, and it was flat, and I could rub my thumb across it and feel the R-E-S-T. And I'm still figuring out what rest is. But one of the things I know is that my list of to do often is sometimes, or can be, a bit of self-aggression. Like I've got to do these things to be worthwhile. And it gets very focused on doing. And when I focus on rest, and when I steep in words of scripture or a Mary Oliver poem, then I find myself open to listening to the Spirit, to my true self, which my true self, guess what, Keith, does not have a list. I mean, literally, my true self has no list I've been able to find. And that is really good news to me. It's all about love. So I'm glad you asked about Lectio, because I think there are many ways to do it. And the main thing is we all need food, this sort of sacred food. And there's so many ways to do it. And then, you know, people often talk about contemplation being, or centering prayer, having these, I like to refer to them as non-steps, but like 4 non-steps. And of course, you know, you start with Lectio. Everything starts with the food, really. Different ways to do it, but we start with, take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And both Brother Lawrence and Anonymous have that as their foundation. And I think I can even forget this sometimes, in the sense of, I sometimes just want to focus on contemplation, but it all starts, the soil of contemplation is Lectio, and other things too, like just our own life experiences. But definitely Lectio is something they both assumed as oxygen in the room.
Beautiful, beautiful. I love that. I love all of that. And it points to, yeah, the delicate balance between silence and sound, and the like finiteness of words and the infiniteness of the emptiness when you let go of the words in contemplation. And we need both. And I think of Thomas Keating, as you've referenced, has said contemplation is resting in God. So how do we go about doing that? And you're saying Lectio is sort of at the start of that. What advice would you give to somebody that maybe is new to the practice, or maybe has done Lectio over the years but needs to readjust or recommit? Where would you point someone for starting either an attitude or a practice of Lectio Divina?
That's a really good question. First of all, I would say hunger is the best cook. So I would say, whether intellectually, which we all have sometimes intellectually we know we need something, and sometimes we have a heart burning need. And so they're kind of different yearnings, but they all amount to a really good thing. And I think hunger is the best cook, in the sense of, if I want to practice Lectio Divina, I will do it even before I know what Lectio Divina is. Like I started carrying around little, as I thought of them then, little Bible verses with me during graduate school, really, when I was going through a time of depression, chronic depression and insomnia. And my depressive mind was high functioning mostly, but it was very ruminative. And into those ruminations, I would put these Bible verses to chew on. Like literally, I mean, later I went to counseling, and that was helpful too. So I'm not saying this is the only solution, but that really helped me to have something to chew on. So what I'm saying is, I started practicing Lectio Divina before I knew that was Lectio Divina. To me, it was just meditating on Bible verses because I was desperate. So, but for advice, I would say, number 1, trust your gut. I would think, what verse would make me feel good to read? Like, feel good. So for me, it is one of them. I mean, there are so many to choose from. And then there's also Thelma Hall's book, Too Deep for Words. I mean, there are many others, Christine Walters Paintner, James Finley. So many people have really good books on Lexio. But Thelma Hall has also a list of possible verses, but you know, you could pick your own. Pick a verse or a few words or a passage. There's no, I mean, be willing to experiment. That really makes you feel good, that you feel, you know how it is. It's kind of like some days for lunch, I think I really want some cottage cheese. And I'm so happy if I have some in the fridge because that's just what I want. You know, we know what and cottage cheese is good protein. So we can trust our hungers and pay attention to them and honor them. And so pick a verse and just remember, it's like often students say to me, does this paragraph need to be 5 sentences or 4 sentences? I mean, often we think, so for Lexio, do I need this many words or that many words? Or pick what means something to you. It can be short. And then sit with it, read it a couple of times slowly. First of all, just the fact that we've paused is great. And if we only know intellectually that we want to do Lexio, but we don't enjoy it, or we find our minds get distracted, the prayer I pray then is, I really know I need to do this, but I'm not interested. I mean, I have those times. Like I know I really would be I feel intellect. I mean, I can tell that it's kind of like sometimes when I think I really should eat a salad, that would be very good for me. And I tell myself, go buy a salad. Then I will say to the Spirit, I don't really want to do this. Would you help me anyway? Like, help me know what to do in the middle of not wanting to. And then read it a couple of times, like, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. And it's not school. You're not reading it to figure it out. You're not reading it to take a test on it. So you can actually celebrate, I am not in school. I'm not meant to engage the figuring it out part of my mind to take a test. I'm meant to listen as if the Spirit is speaking to me through these words. That's simple. Any kid can do that. I mean, we just have to pause, which is often takes us away from our to-do list. So that's healthy. And then read it and just listen. I mean, listen to the words. And then there always will be a word or words that really jump out at us. Maybe during one reading, it's one word. Maybe in another reading, it's another word. The word that's highlighted. And then honor that. Like just paying attention to what jumps out to you is also honoring yourself. And I think we live in a world that wants to commodify the self and sell the self. So even the simple act of pausing to listen to the word that is highlighted in our souls for us is a big plus. And then read it again. And then like you're chewing on it. I mean, really, I sometimes will read it aloud. Sometimes I will sing it. Sometimes I read it so often it becomes a song. It doesn't have to. That's just my thing. And then I sit with it and I think to myself, what is it saying to me? Like, what is it actually saying to me? And that can be anything for anybody at any time. Is there something that I'm getting a feeling that I need to think about more? Is there something I want to ask for? Is there something I want to be grateful for? Is there something I'm frustrated by? It's a very honest sort of listening and conversation. For me, at the very beginning of this, and still sometimes it was like, what the heck is rest? How come I don't have it? How can I get it? Could you give it to me? How do I even go about, it's like if we really got into people's Lectio Divinas, we would see messiness, but good messiness, like in the kitchen when somebody's made a cake and there's mess. Messiness isn't bad necessarily. And then at the sort of end of that, we have sort of a time where you very wisely brought us back to Thomas Keating of rest. And that is the resting part of just letting go. So it's all leading us to this letting go into an attitude of receptiveness. because we're born, and I know you've been through this very recently with Silas, we're born grasping onto the pacifier, the mother, the father, grabbing the things that we need to survive and letting go in order to have a different point of view that is both gentle, self-compassionate, and also accommodating of listening to others. And how can I make the world a kinder place? Is there some way I can help alleviate suffering just by being human and paying attention? In that rest is where we get this rewiring, like Richard Rohr talks about. We get this rewiring away from our small to-do list, which can be very helpful. I'm not telling us we need to give up our to-do list, but it helps us get away from it a little bit into this more expansive point of view that's very reorienting. So I would say, pretend you're a child and experiment. Like, pretend that this Lectio Divina experiment, even if you've done it before, pretend it can be new again. And pretend that anything can happen inside of you. Anything can shift. Anything can be healed if you do it. Because like for me, in my doing it, it eventually led me to counseling. So that has been huge for me. And just different ways of seeing things. And also, one of the biggest shifts for me with Lectio Divina has been this self-kindness, like really being as kind to myself as I try to be to those I love. That was novel. That sounds like it shouldn't be novel, Keith, but I was not taught that growing up. That was never a sermon. It was never was there a title of a sermon, be kind to yourself. It was more like produce, do well. And so I think there's some rewiring that we all can benefit from through this Lectio, because it brings us into the world of the Spirit. And the world of the Spirit is just love. That's the joy. It returns us to love. And that is something I know we all need. I know I do.
Yeah, beautiful. Beautiful. I know I'm thinking about the putting on the mind of Christ. Like, I have the mind of Keith 24 hours out of the day, or enough of the day. If I can put on the mind of Christ, get some rewiring going on, that wouldn't be such a bad thing. But I want to say one thing I love about what you shared about Lectio is finding a verse or a statement that you want to say, something that makes you feel good, because that's such a good entryway into contemplation, because we know in contemplation it doesn't always feel good. It's boring. We have a busy mind. You talked about the shadow work, unconscious, old memories, old trauma comes up to mind, and we think we're doing it wrong. And so it's not always that comfortable to sit in the silence, but to chew on the words that you want to hear that are good for your spirit. That's a beautiful starting point, and I appreciate that. We don't often hear that, at least I don't. So, yeah. So I'm wondering, can you share a little bit about what is this unknowing that you reference? I mean, we have the book, The Cloud of Unknowing, and Brother Lawrence, who talks similarly about unknowing. And what is this unknowing, and how do they help us access it ourselves?
How do they help us? What was it? How do they
Access the unknowing mind.
Yeah, how do they help us access ourselves? At first I thought you said, how do they help us exit ourselves? And I was like, well, that works too. But how do they help us access ourselves? It's a very good question. One of the things I want to say at this point, just to bring us back to reality, is how dangerous this concept has been over the years in the church. So I want to think about one of my friends, Marguerite Porte, who was a mystic also in France. And she talked about unknowing, like letting go. And she wrote, book, The Mirror. And in it, she talked about how people, she kind of alluded to the fact that we humans tend to be arrogant and like we have to know things and have to have things our way. And people got so upset in the church that they burned her at the stake. So I don't want to forget how, when we talk about unknowing, historically, that has not been a popular, it's very countercultural. And later, as the way this often works in the church, sometime later, they reassessed the situation and said, you know, actually, she's not a heretic. But I used to teach this in a medieval women mystics course at another college. And I used to tell my students, but you know, you cannot unburn a burning at the stake. I mean, this has been historically, this, I think, what I want to say is this concept of really living out unknowing has serious consequences for empire. I don't know how else to put it. It is not the system currently. It's what, you know, Richard Rohr talks about. It is a countercultural approach, and it is rooted in gentleness, but it definitely is not what the world itself is expecting. And how it would look is, well, for Anonymous in the Cloud of Unknowing, he says, so when he teaches contemplation, he says we have to learn to have some sort of relationship with our thoughts. Because if we don't have a relationship with our thoughts, then we have a sort of a default system of a program. So we're programmed rather than thinking and having agency. So kind of like being an automaton to whatever system, you know, we've developed or live in. And so he says we've got to, and it's very Buddhist here in the way he says we've got to look at what the Buddhists would call the monkey mind or the horse mind, you know, this moving. I have a friend who calls it the popcorn mind. I also think that works. But he says we've got to look at it. And I love thinking, he says he's so wise about his thoughts. I love it when people who thought about their thoughts write about thinking about their thoughts. Because he says, why are we surprised that we have thoughts? It is just part of being human. So, you know, sometimes we feel overwhelmed and we're like, oh my God, I just didn't have all these thoughts. But that's about like saying, I really wish I didn't have to breathe. I mean, it's just a part of being human, having thoughts. And sometimes when I go to the marsh and I look at the gray clouds rolling in or the sunshine rolling through the clouds, I think these are my thoughts. You know, you see the clouds scudding along and you're like, those are my thoughts. And I myself am the blue sky. And the Cloud of Unknowing author, he says to us, we have got, and he personifies thoughts. He calls them he. It really is a bit freaky to read in the original because he says, when thoughts come to you, and he says, when he comes to you, like it's like thoughts are really alive parts of, I mean, it's very psychologically astute is what I'm trying to say. He says, you know, what you're trying to do is either look around them at something else, which would be love, and you really are trying to look over their shoulder and focus on love. He says, but if you just feel totally overwhelmed, because we sometimes talk about meditation and contemplation, like one thought's going to come in and we're going to let go of it. And another thought's going to come in and we're going to let go of it. But we don't talk as often about the being drenched in thoughts, like you got caught out in the rain without an umbrella. Like, what do we do then? We just like take a scoop and like, do we put, I mean, how do you shift that? And he says, if you feel overwhelmed by your thoughts, he says, one way you can do it is you sink into them and give up. You say, I failed at this. I love that. He says, you sink under them and you kind of wave a white flag and go, okay. You know, you just let go of it. And you find a peace within that sort of giving up. And his focus then is, he says, you have also your one sacred word that you pick or that picks you. For me, it was never a question. I'm not going to say what mine is. I remember I heard Cynthia Bourgeault say once, usually people don't share. I kind of keep it to myself. But he says it should be one syllable. I know centering prayer says it can be one or two syllables, or it can be a short phrase or, you know, a couple of words, or it can be a glance or an image. For me, mine is the simplest possible. But, you know, he says that too. But it's not like there's a rule, you know, it's whatever works for somebody. And he says, And I'm not so sure now, Keith, I don't know if I can gently disagree with Anonymous. He says you take it, and he literally says you beat against the cloud of unknowing, this sort of mystery level, of love, where our minds can't know love. Only love can know love, or openness. But he says we take our sacred word and we beat with it against it. And that just to me is a little not as gentle as I would like it to be, but that's okay. Whatever worked for him. And he says, and really what he's saying is, and we let go. We let go of the thoughts gently, like they come in and we let them go. I like the way Cynthia Bourgeault teaches it. When you catch yourself thinking, or thinkings, when you catch yourself thinking, you let the thought or thoughts go. Like there's this, and she always emphasizes, and so does Brother Lawrence, you do it gently. That to me is the most important point, is that you let them go gently. When you catch yourself thinking, you let them go gently, and you can use your sacred word to sort of signal that intention. And then you might say, but when I use my sacred word, isn't that like a thought? But not if we're using it as a sort of a finger pointing at the moon, so to speak, of our intention to let it go. It tends to become like a tool, the sacred word. It does have meaning somewhere deep down, but you also notice, and I'm sure you've experienced this, where when you're doing centering prayer or contemplation and you're trying to let go of the thoughts, all of a sudden your sacred word or words will just appear. And it kind of like then they go up with it. So I definitely would say the unknowing part is that part of letting go of our thinking that is so needed to make space. I think, like, you're being so kind, Keith, to host this wonderful Mystic Summit. And I really appreciate it. You and Dr. Jana Rensel, and I know y'all are doing a lot behind the scenes, but you're making space for all of us to have this conversation. And it's like, if I'm having thoughts 24/7 of, as you put it, like my Keith mind, my Carmen mind, if that's on 24/7, I don't have a space within me to have a conversation with God or love or mystery or the ultimate source or my true self. Those seem synonymous to me. And so by letting go, I make space to go, oh, wow. Oh, wow. It's like pulling up in my driveway. It really, to me, sometimes when I'm doing this contemplation, sort of intentionally in a sitting, like not just on the go, which I also like to do, but if I'm sitting and doing it, sometimes it just feels like, wow, I'm driving up in my driveway, I'm home. And I mean, that can happen also in the to-go, what I call my to-go contemplating. I was talking with Seifu, Reverend Seifu over at SDI, and I was telling him how I thought Brother Lawrence's contemplative practices, the practice of the presence, was to-go contemplation. And he said, does that make Anonymous's Cloud of Unknowing contemplation practices a la carte? And I thought, yeah, it does kind of, but you can do both to go. You can do both, a la carte. And the thing is, I know you probably will ask this because you ask the best questions, but one of the things I love about both of these teachers, Brother Lawrence and Anonymous, is they don't make themselves out to be gurus. They are not sitting on top of a mountain going, come to me, sit at my feet, and you will learn how to do this. That is so far from who they are. They are saying, here's what worked for me. You go and try whatever you think will work for you, and then come back and tell me what worked for you. I'm sure you can teach me. Now, that's community, isn't it? I think. I mean, that is much more inspiring to me than somebody thinking they have the only way to do this.
I love that. And I know that line in the Cloud, or maybe it's the book or Privy Council, where it's like, if you figure out a better way to do this, come and tell me, let me know. I love that so much.
Exactly. I would like to say that. I would almost like to have that on the front of the book, because sometimes the Cloud of Unknowing is treated as this almost like, what do you call it? Like unicorn book, like this special, like honored and sacred book. And I'm more like, that line from it to me makes him a teacher's teacher, where he says, you figure out a better way, please come back and tell me. That's what a good teacher would say. Like, I want to know what works for you. I'm glad you brought that one up, because that was the one I was thinking of, where he does say that is the most hopeful thing. And the other thing is, it shows his true humility, Keith. You know, I mean, he really does want to know what his student, what works best for them. And he honors their sincerity of seeking in that. And he doesn't take away their agency at all. He's like saying, look, we're alongside each other, and we're in this together. So yeah.
It's beautiful. Beautiful. Well, tell me more, I guess, about Brother Lawrence. And you've given us the clouds unknowing, and what is this practice on the go for Brother Lawrence, or what does it mean to unknow with Brother?
Well, with Brother Lawrence, what it means to unknow is, at every moment that we can, this is what he says: we return to love, or God, however one wants to term the mystery, the ultimate source. He says, before you begin a task, return to love. Like, if I'm about to open my emails, I might say, I'm about to open my emails. Could you please be with me? Give me wisdom. He says, as you're doing your task, you say, can you help me with this? He did not like kitchen work, and he was assigned, limping and in pain, to kitchen work for decades. For 100 brothers, this is not an intimate dinner party. This is serious work. Like, I just want to sit with that a minute. And he's in pain. And plus, he didn't like doing it. He says he had an aversion to it. But I can picture him saying, here I am, just to himself, making the soup. You know, I don't like making the soup, God, but could you help me make the soup? And people said along the way, after his first 10 years of dark night of the soul, where he practiced the presence out of need for his own healing, and he saw no movement that he could tell. He was stressed. He was in grief. He felt horrified by his past experiences with harming himself or others, or things he had seen. But over time, people say he came to cook with love. So he turned it from a chore and something he disliked to like a sacrament. And it's interesting, because that's exactly what Dogen says in his cooking book in the Buddhist tradition, how important the cook of a monastery is. And Brother Lawrence turned it into that sacrament. And then he says, when you're done, so he has this this arc of three. He says, and when you're done making the soup, if it went well, you say, hey, thanks. I really appreciate that it went well. And I wonder, how often are we thankful? It's one of the practices I really try to be alert to, because it's freeing. And he says, and if it didn't go so well, he says, you say, well, I appreciate that you helped me do my best. I'll just try to do better next time. I really appreciate that, because I'm the kind of person who critiques my I used to play basketball. After the game was over, I'd replay everything and see what I did wrong, mostly, you know, and that kind of carries over into your adult life. I love the fact that he says, well, I asked you to help me. You helped me. I did my best. I'll try to do better next time. That's just so freeing. And my friend Mother Bushbeck used to say, her husband was in a Russian prison camp during World War II, and he was a contemporary of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He was a Lutheran minister. She said she prayed for him to come home. She had 8 children. They were refugees during World War II over in Germany, Frau Bushbeck. And she said when her husband came home, she saw this stranger walking down the street. She hadn't heard from him in 5 years much, and saw this stranger who she recognized by his gait. He didn't look like himself. And she said, ever after that, every day, I thank God for letting my husband come home. And I think, how many things have I asked God for? Like, let's say, a kind spouse. How often am I thankful for that? You know what I'm saying? So I think Brother Lawrence, really part of his practice of the presence was gratitude. Like, even in this, please help me with making the soup. I'm making the soup. I don't enjoy it. Could you show me what to do next. And then, well, I did my best. Thank you for helping me with it. He really has gratitude baked in. And then he says, you should even do this as often as you can, even during times of recreation. So, and during times of prayer. You know, he thinks, so what I'm trying to say is, when I was young, I heard a preacher, and this just shows you how good can come from, I heard a lot of hellfire and damnation sermons growing up in the evangelical church, but one preacher quoted from Pray Without Ceasing, and that just grabbed my little kid mind. And I've heard Mirabai Starr, and I've talked about this. She said she had a similar experience. And I thought, that sounds impossible. I want to do it. That's what I thought. Because my mind was always whirling, you know, my mind scared me. It was whirling so much. And Brother Lawrence says, you want to do this as often as you can. And then there's this gentle little caveat. He says, and if you forget, it's no big deal. When you remember, you're welcomed back. So it's not punitive. It's not like you're saying at the end of the day, I believe I spent X percentage of time practicing the presence. No, it's more like a dialogue with someone. You don't judge it so much as you just practice it and you deepen the relationship. And so he says, you try to do this as often as you can, whenever you can. And the other thing he says that I love is he says, he gives us some phrases to use, like, God of love, I am all yours. Love, please create in me a new heart. And please help me to grow. So he gives us a few little phrases. And then he says, just like that point you quoted from the Cloud of Unknowing, he opens it up and he says, or whatever words or phrases love gives to you on the spot. I love he says that, on the spot. So as you make it up as you go, he says. And another thing that he says that I think is so real, Brother Lawrence says, you would be surprised the conversations that happen in these micro moments of returning to love throughout the day in the presence prayer. He says, you would be surprised. Now, to my experience, it is things like, I'm grieving here. What do I do next? Or I'm totally lost. What do I do? Or I am angry. I am so mad. What do I do? I mean, and it can also be, I'm grateful, but it can be these things we don't often talk about, you know, the things, the raw emotions that really happen in our moment to moment existence. I think that's what he's covering there, where he says, you would be surprised what comes up. I think he's giving us a little window into his own experience, because Keith, he says when he looked back on his youth, he looked back and the word he uses is horror, horror. Now, he was a soldier in a war that had many crimes against humanity. I think of the war against Ukraine and all wars. I don't know what he saw, what he did. I do know he was a prisoner of war. He was captured by German troops. He was questioned, maybe tortured. So I don't know what he's talking about there, but when Brother Lawrence says horror, I think he's talking about maybe something very serious. And the fact that he could work it out gives me great hope. And then he brings in gratitude. He says, over every time he mentions practice the presence, he says, and we be grateful. We ask for help and we be grateful. So he makes it into a dialogue. In other words, he says, anybody, this is what I love the most. He says, anyone is capable of these many, so M-A-N-Y, M-I-N-I. Anyone is capable of these many conversations with God or love. And there's no A, B, or C. We just make it up as we go. So that's what he's about. And, you know, you have people like Archbishop Francois Fenelon saying, wow, he's amazing. You know, it's like if, I don't know, somebody like Basil Hume or somebody, you know, back in the day when I was like in high school said, wow, Carmen's really wise. I mean, he wouldn't have said that, but I mean, it's like the inequity between Francois Fenelon and Brother Lawrence was great. And the fact that this unassuming, unprivileged monk got the attention of these churchmen and their support tells us a lot, I think.
Amen. Well, beautiful. So good, Carmen. You brought these two people to life, human people to life, in a really special way, and given me some really practical pointers for practice, which is always invaluable because, yeah, practice is the best teacher. Carmen, do you have any closing words for us?
I don't know. We've covered so much. Your questions were so good. I like your closing statement of practice is the best teacher. And I would also say it makes me really grateful for communities like Closer Than Breath and others where you can come together with like-minded people. Because my friend Mother Bushbeck used to say, when you have one coal lit, it can go cold and out pretty quickly. But if you have 5 or 6 or a bunch of coals together, all red hot and together, they can stay smoldering and warm much longer. So I think one of the aspects that Barbara Holmes always points out is contemplation is community. So I don't want to overlook the fact that the community and the interconnectedness of this is outward looking, and also we need others to be alongside us in this journey. So thank you, Keith, for being one of mine. Really appreciate you.
Thank you, Carmen. Give us just a couple places people can connect with you.
Well, thanks to my husband's intelligence, I have a website that he's trying to teach me how to do. It's www.carmenbutcher.com. I left out the Acevedo because it was just too hard for people to spell. And so it's just carmenbutcher.com. And then I'm on Instagram and I'm on Facebook and also, LinkedIn and Twitter. And I have a link tree that's Carmen Acevedo Butcher. So I think if you just put in Carmen Acevedo Butcher, you can find me pretty easily. And I'd love people come visit.
Beautiful. Carmen, thank you from the bottom of my heart. Always great to talk and be with you.
Thank you so much, Keith. It's a joy. I really appreciate you and your work.